One of the key difficulties for China is it's owed so much money. It wants this loans to be paid back, but it simultaneously still wants to position itself as a leading voice in now the term we're using, the global south is back again, and that it is an advocate of the interests of low and middle income countries. Because the Chinese economy is slowing, because they're heading towards a rocky or rough patch, because they have their own problems with debts in their own domestic banks, these are loans they can't just write off, that they can't just wave away.
Welcome to the Gist on Strat News Global. I'm Ramananda Sengupta. Our special guest today is Dr. Walter Lck, Senior Lecturer in International Relations, Department of War Studies at King's College London. His interests include US foreign policy, South Asian security, irregular warfare, and the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific. That's quite a mouthful.
Indeed.
He's also the author of The Forgotten Front, Patron-Client Relationships and Counterinsurgency, which looks at relations between the US and local government. It is supporting in counterinsurgency, and he's currently writing a book on Indian defense policy. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I know you have a very hectic schedule, and I appreciate you taking time out for this. Today, let's talk about the presentation you made at this conference here today. I think what was it titled? The sort of a dilution of the Belt and Road.
The diminishing effectiveness ?
The diminishing effect of the Belt and Road. Why do you think it is diminishing?
So actually, the reason why it had the question mark in the title is to question or challenge that assumption. So when the BRI first came on the scene and it was first announced, there was a lot of concern, and this was seen as this really important geostrategic, geoeconomic development, right? It wasn't seen just about infrastructure. In some circles, it was seen as being a tool that the Chinese government would use to spread their economic and political influence. And we saw a number of states quite willing to take Chinese money and Chinese investment, which was concerning. Then, as we got into a period of time in which we saw the challenges that countries like Sri Lanka or Zambia faced, the uncompleted projects in a number of countries, particularly ones that were meant to be the showpieces of the Belt and Road Initiative. So I'm thinking about CPEC in Pakistan, for example. There began this sort of new narrative to emerge that said, the Chinese may have bitten off more than they could chew, that this wasn't that effective, that it wasn't going anywhere, and perhaps it was a bit in retreat. And even the conference organizers initially approached me to ask about, could I talk about how it's diminishing effectiveness, how this is not going anywhere. And the reason I wanted to kind of push back against that is because we do see evidence and we do see signs that the mistakes and the errors from the first decade are being studied, are being learned, and they're now taking steps to insulate this grand project. And keep in mind, this is Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy initiative, to try and insulate it going forward. So I think it would be a mistake for us to assume that we can just pat ourselves on the back or breathe a big sigh of relief because the Chinese have made a mistake and the BRI is going away. So that's why I put the title as it was.
Mm-hmm. So essentially what you were trying to say is that the BRI might be down but is not out. That's number one. I think that was a very interesting point that you made. And number two, that the competitors that have come up to sort of replace it, and there's a whole lot, I think you mentioned 4 or 5, they better sort of get their act together and be able to deliver very quickly.
Yes. I think that's where the new competition is emerging, because we're seeing steps. The Chinese have learned not to trust their own development banks, which don't have the sophistication or the tools to do the proper risk management or analysis of projects. So now the Chinese government is pulling in Western commercial banks like BNP Paribas and Standard Chartered, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, partners with the BRI. So these are people who can look at loans and figure out if the governments can pay them back. They can look at projects and figure out if they're economically viable. So the Chinese government isn't going to continue pouring funds into black holes like it did in maybe the first decade. So the reason this is important, when paired with the fact that they are now more aware of some of the social problems, some of the environmental problems that some of the projects they undertook have with them, whether it's the G7, whether it's the Quad, whether it's multinational big corridors like coming out of the G20 with the India, Middle East, Europe, the message that everyone has explicitly or implicitly is that, okay, these guys are low quality. We can compete on transparency. We can compete on accountability. We can compete on quality, which is true. But if the Chinese are getting better, and if they're insulating some of their projects from these risks, the thing they're really good at is delivery. They deliver better and faster than the G7 countries do traditionally, better than the multinational development banks. So you do have an offer on transparency and accountability, but you need to pair that then with delivery. So we need to move out of a talking phase, we need to move into an execution phase, and we really need to realize that there's a window of opportunity while the BRI is being rebooted to get a move on, but these guys aren't waiting, and they are learning from their mistakes, and they are smart strategic actors.
Mm-hmm. But wouldn't that sort of, act against their own interest in the sense that it would actually slow them down if they were to use these Western banks? Because they would go through due process, due diligence, that would take time.
So on the one hand, the project data we have so far that shows actually this hasn't slowed them down. But the bigger issue is once we start to look at the aggregate exposure China has to low and middle income countries, the estimates kind of vary, but basically between 1.1 and 1.5 trillion US dollars is now owed to China from the developing world. And that's just the principal. That's not even the interest. So, yes, China has a big economy. Yes, China has a lot of foreign exchange reserves. I don't think there's any country in the world that cannot worry about $1 trillion in debt that's sitting out there. So they want to get paid back. They want to get paid back. So the risk management, the due diligence is in part a tool to insulate, because ultimately they didn't put this money out in the world to see it disappear and dissipate.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. But, could you elaborate on how you see this BRI version 2 sort of developing some contours of what you see coming up, other than this, using foreign banks too?
So just improved risk management, so awareness to problems that have existed in the past that led to sort of cancellations and delays in projects. Insulating themselves to a degree of criticism by, as I said, co-opting Western financial institutions into some of the delivery. And again, much more sophistication in terms of the risk management, the assessment of the viability of loans and projects, which means that we're probably not going to see Hambantota 2.0. We're not going to see an airport built somewhere that has, makes absolutely no financial sense. So it will become a project where the execution is apparently, from again what we've seen, not going to be significantly delayed, and it's going to be then things that are not as likely to provoke the backlash. Now, I'm not saying that by any means in the near future will they be 100% at a, say, G7 level of quality or transparency, but it could be good enough, transparent enough, accountable enough that makes it a lot harder to use that as a selling point for your alternative, or to provoke a popular backlash against too much investment from China.
In your presentation, you mentioned something about corruption and other things that sort of, come as part of the package. I think the way I've been hearing is that they first come and bribe the officials concerned and say that, look, you give us this contract and I'll give you this much. And that's how the whole process starts. Wouldn't running all this through the bank sort of take away that liberty?
Yeah, so look, there's no question that in certain cases, in certain areas, BRI projects were perhaps vanity projects, or were specifically calculated. And again, I keep coming back to the Sri Lankan example because it is so it's so illustrative. But when you're building a not needed airport in the president's constituency, or you're building a second port alongside one that already exists, there's a clear political calculation. But you also shouldn't have the vision that the only reason countries are willing to take Chinese money is because of corruption. In a lot of cases, it's because they're the ones who are offering, right? You know, we have to be careful when we look at some of these situations. It's not that every single leader of a developing country is incompetent, corrupt, unsophisticated. In some cases, they're aware of the risks of doing business with the Chinese, but what's the alternative? The G7 isn't offering them. The World Bank isn't offering them. The IMF isn't offering them. And they say to this, when you raise the criticism, say, yes, we know their risks, we know their dangers. What's your competitive offer? Where is your offer on the table? Because these guys are saying they're going to build this railroad we need. Where are you? And this is the where are you part needs to be answered by the G7, by the Quad, by the interested parties who think they need to kind of compete or provide alternatives.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that I've been hearing from a lot of people is that, the Chinese really don't have any moral scruples about, not being friendly with a non-democratic, autocratic nation or whatever that may be. And even those countries don't really want the sanctimonious advice that comes along with aid from the US. Do you think that could be beaten by the Western power? Would the banks come up with that kind of stuff?
So look, this is going to be an advantage for the Chinese with respect to certain countries. And we even saw in the presentation given by the delegate from Kenya who was talking about the Lamu Port project. And he said one of the attractive things about working with the Chinese is that there are no conditions on it. There are no conditions at all. And it's very clear that BRI projects and BRI funding are used for strategic political gains. And I'll give you two key ways in which this happens. One is the researchers at William & Mary University have identified the fact that 2/3 of all the BRI projects that are out there are in countries that are not either clearly pro-American or pro-Chinese.
Right.
So it's what you might call the persuadable middle in international politics, people who could be brought over to their side. Now, the Chinese will double down and they will invest more in countries that have shifted to be more pro-China, but they're not taking what they call moonshots. Countries that are very staunchly pro-American, they're not trying to put money into.
Okay.
They're not trying to persuade those people. So they're being calculating in that respect. The other thing that comes out of a study of when projects are proposed and initiated, change of governments matter quite a lot. So if a new government comes in a country, and we could look at a country like Argentina, which is going through elections and has a very clearly China-friendly and China-unfriendly candidate, if a China-friendly candidate comes into power, suddenly there is a lot of infrastructure money that gets unlocked very quickly because the Chinese want to deliver a win to the friendly candidate. If an unfriendly candidate comes to power, their scope for, say, renegotiating loan repayment terms or windows goes to about zero. So they're using this as a tool to reward or punish governments depending on their stance towards Beijing.
You mentioned that China is the world's largest sort of, creditor in that sense, people. 1.5 trillion, you said.
Up to 1.5, yes.
Without, that's just the
principal, not even the interest, yeah.
Now, right now, China is also going through a sort of an economic downswing.
Yeah.
So how do you relate the two? What if those other countries, start reneging on their debts and stuff?
Well, and this is the one of the key difficulties for China is it's owed so much money. It wants this loans to be paid back, but it simultaneously still wants to position itself as a leading voice in now the term we're using, the global south is back again, and that it is an advocate of the interest of low and middle income countries. Well, it's a bit hard to do both. So on the one hand, they are pledging solidarity and sympathy while increasing the penalty interest rates for repayments. For new BRI projects, they're basically mandating countries to put money in an escrow account that they will just sweep out unilaterally as a debt payment. So these two things are going to come to a head because the Chinese economy is slowing, because they're heading towards rocky or rough patch, because they have their own problems with debts in their own domestic banks. These are loans they can't just write off, that they can't just wave away, but how they manage to keep their primary many of whom are in pretty dire financial states, solvent enough to pay them back, without alienating them, this is going to be a very interesting needle that they're going to have to thread.
It would be very, very interesting to watch. This is a subject we could really talk a lot about, because I was fascinated by your presentation here at the thing. But we have a very short window for this interview, so I'll cut it down to two last questions. One, among the competitors that we mentioned, do you think if they were to get together and get their act together, there really is a chance to push back against the BRI?
I think so there's a couple questions I think that come out of this. One of the other things, and again, it's a new phenomenon, so we can't definitively answer it at this point, but as China is working to make some aspects of the BRI financing process more transparent, as they are working to put in some degree of environmental standards and labor safeguards and things like that, again, not to perhaps a G7 level, but something more, does this project become less of a geopolitical concern, right? Because as your prior question sort of alluded to, in its early days, the BRI was seen or worried about being something part of an effort to make the world safe for autocrats, right? That they would lock in these countries into loans and infrastructure structures that didn't respect a lot of the rules-based values that our various countries are working to uphold. Now, if the Chinese are shifting, if they're making their projects a little more amenable to these kinds of things, does that mean that the BRI is a bit less of a concern? Or is this a bit of a Trojan horse thing that disarms criticism while being just as worrisome? So that's the first question, is to what extent does a sort of modified BRI 2.0, is it something that needs to be kind of competed against? But secondly, look, the financial firepower exists. If you take just say the G7 as a collective, they spend twice as much as China does in development financing. The Quad comes close. They don't quite match China's spending, but they're getting very close. So it certainly exists in the aggregate in terms of the raw materials. The question is whether we have the companies and the engineers to do these kinds of infrastructure projects in a similar enough manner on a close enough timeline that it would be a real alternative. And I think again, this is where we're getting closer to seeing that. And you have countries that, for their own political reasons, the Philippines have walked away from the Belt and Road Initiative, right? Other countries are voting with their feet. So we should never count out the agency and autonomy of recipient countries, right? They're learning lessons. Everyone's looked and studied Sri Lanka. They're no fools. So I think that combination of factors can give us hope, but we shouldn't be we shouldn't think that the level of challenge is not a serious one, because it's it is a quite high level challenge.
That's interesting, but I have a whole bunch of questions, but I'll just take it to the last question. You're writing a book on Indian defense policy, and if you could just tell us in a very short couple of sentences to what the book is all about.
Absolutely. So what my co-author and I want to do is provide a single volume that would help everyone from the average Indian citizen to foreign diplomats to understand how the system in India works, right? Because India is a democracy, but it is one in which the defense establishment is not always characterized by the highest degrees of transparency. So if you work on it and study India, you come to learn, how do soldiers, sailors, and airmen get recruited? How do budgets get set? What is the role of parliament in providing oversight or not? Who makes decisions? Because I think a lot of times, and I see this sitting in London, and I saw this sitting in Washington, D.C. before that, people look across and they mirror image. Right? They say, oh, well, the chief of the army in our system, he has a lot of power and a lot of influence, and he says stuff, and therefore this will happen. So therefore, the chief of the Indian army must have a similar level of power and influence. But the relationship of the services to the bureaucracy and to the politicians is very different. You would look at, say, the United States, and you would see these Senate Armed Services Committee and House Armed Services Committee, very powerful, very influential, and say, oh, well, so clearly the Standing Committee on Defense has a lot of influence on how policy gets shaped. No, the system is different in this respect. So trying to explain how the system works, but also why it's really important. again, for one of our target audiences is average Indian citizens. This is a sizable portion of the union budget every single year. They should understand how and why decisions get made, how perhaps some things could be done a bit better, but also the important work that is being done and the sacrifices and the risks that the service members undertake. So it's a book that's supposed to explain, illuminate, maybe point out some areas for improvement, but to educate more than anything else.
I'm sold already. I have the first copy. I'll send it to you for an autograph.
I'm happy to do that.
Thank you so very much. I really appreciate
I'm very happy to
time
take
out
the
on
time.
this. And I look forward to having you with us again. Maybe once your book is released, we could talk about
That'd be wonderful. I'd be very happy to.
So thanks again. And that was Dr. Walter Ladwig from King's College London, talking to us about why we shouldn't be complacent about the BRI and China's sort of, economic slowdown, because BRI 2 just might be something more than what the rest of the world could handle. And this is, I think, a fair warning coming in from Dr. Ladwig. I do hope you liked this particular show, and if you did, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Till we meet again, this is Ramananda Sengupta.